introducing our next speaker, who's going to be showcasing the first session. Her name is Mary Bogus, and she's the Senior Program Strategist with the Analyst Institute. And if you haven't heard about the Analyst Institute, check them out. They are amazing. Mary serves as a program analyst at the Analyst Institute. She supports partners with the strategic use and implementation of data and Analyst Institute's research with an eye towards becoming experiment ready. Before joining the Analyst Institute in 2018, Mary served as the Deputy Director at the Colorado Civic Engagement Roundtable, supporting progressive civic engagement organizations through trainings, coaching, and data support. Mary actually is the daughter of a public school teacher and a social worker. Originally from Wyoming, she now lives in Denver with her partner and their 2 cats and 2 dogs. So thank you so much, Mary, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Paku. I feel like I actually need to update my bio because I had a baby. Yeah, I had a little 5-month-old. She's taking a nap downstairs. And she's the most amazing thing in the world. So I got to update that bio. But well, thank you so much for having me here today. Like Paku said, my name's Mary Bogus. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a senior program strategist at Analyst Institute. And Analyst Institute is an organization. We've been around for a little bit over a decade. And we essentially run experiments or tests on campaign and political messaging and tactics to try to figure out what works and a lot of times what doesn't work. Oh, thank you so much. I'm seeing the chat. Thanks, y'all. I could talk about my baby all day. And so I am super excited to be here today to share with you essentially over a decade's worth of research on GOTV, Get Out the Vote, Turnout tactics. So what we're going to be covering today, obviously, you all probably know better than anybody that we are in a very, very difficult and interesting period in U.S. history, especially those of you who are running for office this year. A lot of stuff at top of mind. And I want to be clear that what I'm going to talk about today is based off of, like I said, over a decade's worth of research. So there's no sort of like new shiny magic pill message that is going to be the thing that just like turns out all the voters. Obviously we're at the Analyst Institute thinking a lot about how COVID and sort of safe voting practices are impacting organizations' programs. But just kind of want to say that at the outset. I don't want you to think that I'm going to go over something secret and new and special. But so today, I'm going to be really focusing on the sort of best practices when it comes to GOTV messages. And so this is really going to be about changing voter behavior. So when we talk about changing voter behavior, we're primarily talking about people who are historically haven't been consistent voters or are non-voters and trying to move them to being a voter. I'll take a couple seconds to recap. I want to highlight a couple of resources that y'all will have access to. And then I should have updated my slide. I don't think we'll probably have time for Q&A today because I know y'all got some really important script writing work to do. Next slide, please. All right, actually we can skip this one too. Okay, so really, really quickly, just a little bit about Analyst Institute. So we're a group of former organizers, campaign folks. That sort of is my background. I've spent the last 10, 11 years running campaigns, running advocacy, electoral, and legislative campaigns. I sort of cut my teeth working, starting off as an organizer at my local Planned Parenthood affiliate. I meant to say, I'm a very proud Coloradoan. There's like probably the most badass people in Colorado are on this call today. And so I'm very, very proud to also be here today. But so we partner primarily with progressive organizations, candidates, stuff like that, to run what are called randomized control trials. And so a randomized control trial is essentially, we kind of think of it as the most rigorous way to measure whether or not something worked. And it sort of is like the cleanest form to be able to tell, did thing A cause thing B? And so that's primarily what we do. You'll hear me refer to randomized control trials as RCTs, tests, experiments. Those are all kind of the same thing that I'm talking about. But so then we also work, so I work on the community partnerships team. And we work to make sure that this really important work gets into the hands of practitioners, candidates, folks that are running, field programs, things like that. And we do this through the Analyst group, which is sort of our community of, again, sort of those research folks, academic folks, as well as campaign folks, again, to try to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And then we a lot of times make recommendations to the community. So what I'm going to cover today is actually probably some of our most popular recommendations that we make to the progressive community, to candidates, things like that. All right, so we can keep going on. So I do want to just do a couple of quick definitions. At Analyst Institute, we talk a lot about data and experimental evidence, and it's really, really important for us that everybody is on the same page when we're talking about these concepts, because we don't ever want to leave anybody behind. We want folks to be able to all participate fully. So these may be things that you're like, duh, Mary, I know this. But again, it's really important that everybody is on the same page when we're talking about these concepts. So really quickly, GOTV, get out the vote, turnout, probably a term that you're all familiar with, but essentially it's targeting supportive voters and getting them to vote. I want to be really clear that GOTV is not about changing minds about your issues or candidates, which I'm going to talk about in a second. Next slide, please. All right, so let's define turnout a little bit more broadly. So turnout, utilizing tactics and messages to change the behavior of voters who vote and less consistent at consistent rates, or folks who have never voted before. So most campaigns, when they do GOTV work, you're really gonna focus on folks that you think might be with you as a candidate, they might be with you on your issue, but these are people who need just a little bit extra support to actually change their behavior. And these, I think, this is where I think Analyst Institute has spent a lot of time thinking and doing research about this. And so we feel really confident in the things that I'm going to share with you today about how to do that, about how to change voter behavior. Next slide. So then persuasion, obviously as candidates, kind of depending on your context, you may also have to persuade some voters, make sure that they understand that you are the best person for the job. And so persuasion is about utilizing messages and tactics to change a voter's opinion on a candidate or an issue. So a lot of times when organizations or campaigns are doing persuasion, they're focusing on those folks that are that are maybe more likely to vote, but may not be decided yet about which candidate they want to vote for. We do have some interesting research, though, that says that folks who actually are less likely to vote also may be really, really good persuasion targets, because they may just not know enough about the voting process or the candidates. And so presenting them with that information is new information. So again, this sort of deciding your strategy between whether you want to persuade or turn folks out really is going to depend on your specific context. So it's not sort of a one size fits all, everybody just does persuasion, then they switch to GOTV. That's kind of the old school way of running campaigns. And so we really want you to think about, what is sort of my particular context and what do I actually need to do? What kind of behavior do I need to change? All right, so we're going to move into some GOTV messaging. Next slide. So, I think we may have skipped one, maybe not. All right, so first thing that I want to say is when it comes to talking, to changing the behavior of sort of less consistent or non-voters, it's really, really important that you focus on the process of voting. So if your goal is to actually increase turnout, you want to focus on the act of voting, not sort of the issue or the candidate. So this is communicating things like dates and deadlines, ID requirements, polling locations. Many of you are going to be running in states that have vote by mail as an option for the first time. Being able to talk to folks really clearly about how they return their ballot or how they vote safely is going to be really, really important. Obviously, I think something to think about is that folks are doing this for the first time. And so giving them the best information is going to be really, really important in helping them return their ballots and vote. All right, we can keep going. All right, so I'm going to talk about, I'm actually going to talk about 3 messages. I'll incorporate the last one a little bit. But so these are 3 messages that we, like I said, have spent almost a decade doing tests on these, and under sort of a lot of different types of elections, a lot of different sizes of elections. And over and over and over again, we've seen that we see positive effects on turnout from utilizing these messages. So we're going to talk about something called voter self-rationalization, plan making, which is something y'all have probably heard of before. And then I'm going to talk about social pressure, and then I'll briefly talk about voting rights if we have time. All right, so voter self-rationalization is essentially the idea, sort of why we think this works, is that it's basically helping a voter sort of self-rationalize the reason that they would vote. And we've seen this work, oh, you can go back. I'm not there yet. So the reason, one of the ways that we've seen this work really, really well is through some of our partners have incorporated voter self-rationalization into their canvassing and phone bank scripts. And so if we can click through, I can kind of show you what that looks like. So you've got the canvasser. On a scale of 1 to 10, or 0 to 10, how likely are you to vote on Tuesday? Voter, you always laugh, kind of looks like me. I don't know, probably a 6. Canvasser, great. We're collecting reasons people are voting. What made you say a 6 rather than a 2? So this is the really, really important piece of voter self-rationalization, is then asking them follow-up question and asking them to sort of rationalize. Voter, it's my civic duty, which is like totally how these conversations go every time, right? So this is a really great way, I think, to start off a conversation with a voter, and to make sure that you're, doing that follow-up piece to actually have a conversation and have them say out loud. So that helps them with the behavior change, is actually verbalizing out loud, hey, yeah, why am I voting? All right, next slide. All right, so the second.
A quick question. Is it purposeful where you like did the lower number? So it's like, oh, what made you say a 6 rather than a 2?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
that is a super, super great flag. So this is also, when you're doing this or your volunteers are doing this, this is something that is going to be really important to train folks on, and to have them sort of, I think, like listen and be responsive versus just like kind of going through a script checklist. And so, yeah, so you'll kind of have to, if someone says an 8, you always want to ask the lower number. So like, why did you say this instead of this? I think more than anything, that's just sort of is like an open-ended way to ask it versus a yes or no question. But yeah, thanks for flagging that. All right, so second messaging item is plan making, which probably a lot of you have heard of plan making before. I think that plan making has become sort of a part of almost like the pop culture vernacular. Like Michelle Obama was talking about plan making, celebrities talk about plan making. But the thing that's really important about plan making is to actually like walk voters through a plan. So it's similar to that self-rationalization, right? It's getting them to say the plan out loud. Plan making isn't effective just when you're like, so voter, do you have a plan to vote? And then sit there and wait for them to respond. It's not effective when you just say like, what is your plan to vote? And then sit there and wait for them to respond. It's really, again, about having that back and forth conversation and being responsive. I think of plan making, like a really good plan making conversation is sort of as like an active listening conversation. So like I said at the top, I have a new baby at home. She is teething right now, which means if somebody called me on the phone to have a GOTV conversation with me, they would probably hear her being a little fussy in the background or screeching like a screech owl. And to me, that would signal, I'd be like, oh, hey, it sounds like you have a kiddo at home. Do you plan to take them with you? Are you thinking that you'll use childcare? So being responsive, as responsive as possible. So again, when you're training volunteers and like training yourself how to do this, it's helpful to have, a list of potential questions, but you don't want to think of it again as sort of that checklist that you just go through. Really think about like that voter's experience and the certain barriers that they might face and help them walk through that, and think through sort of like every piece of it. Again, knowing that a lot of folks are going to be voting by mail for the first time, really helping them visualize like what that process is. And I think really can help them sort of see through point A to point B, well, point A to like point Z, which means that they're more likely to then return their ballot or to vote. All right, we can go to the next slide. So social pressure is the last kind of like messaging concept and tactic that I want to talk about. So social pressure is actually something that it's a concept from social psychology. And it's essentially the concept that if people believe that their behavior is being monitored or is, sort of publicly available, they're more likely to comply with that social norm. So you've probably seen, there's this super famous experiment where, you've got a couple of people on an elevator and all facing backwards. And then a gentleman gets on the elevator who is, not sort of in on it. And more people keep coming on the elevator and they all keep facing the other way. And like, you sort of see this person just like visibly uncomfortable, and eventually like he slowly turns around. So obviously like that's not the way we want to make voters feel, but that's kind of where this concept comes from. And so this is really the tactic and the message that we have spent a lot of time with, and across a lot of different modes of contact. So, putting them in phone banking and canvassing scripts. Mail is a place where we see social pressure work really well. It is consistently one of our most effective messages for changing voter behavior. All right, so we can keep going. So at Analyst Institute, we have actually split up social pressure into a couple of different kinds because it's really important that you use the social pressure that's right for you and your campaign or your organization. And so the first kind that we do is positive social pressure. So this is really like keeping it super positive, thanking the voter for voting in the past. That's a key piece of social pressure, is telling the voter something about their voting record or that of their neighbors. And so this may look something like, you know, hey, Mary, we saw you voted in 2016. Thank you so much for being a voter. Your vote is so critical. So that sort of is the piece of it that's really, really important. So that's positive social pressure. So then the second kind is something called gentle social pressure. So this we typically see through a mail program. A lot of folks will do gentle social pressure by sending out something called a voter report card. And so the voter report card, they compare the voter's vote history to some sort of aggregate of others. So like an experiment that we worked with a Colorado organization on, they sent a social pressure mail piece with this voter report card to an all Latinx universe. And so they compared the individual voter's grade to that of all Latinx voters in the entire state. So there's a lot of different ways that you can do it. But so this, I think, is probably one of the most scalable ways to do social pressure, is to send a voter report card to a voter. So then the last type of social pressure is called hard social pressure. And this is one that we really don't recommend. Hard social pressure sort of takes more of a shame-based approach to voting. So like we'll say, you haven't voted since 2016. What's up with that? Obviously that's like not exactly what the mail piece would say, but that's sort of the general concept. And then they will also do things like compare the vote history to like individual vote data. So it might be something like, oh, Mary, you know, we gave you an A- for voting, but your next door neighbor, Abby, she actually hasn't voted since 2014. So this can be, the reason that we don't recommend this is because it can create a lot of blowback. And I think especially as a candidate, you have to be really, really careful about the messages that you put out to the community. So for candidates, we would probably have you lean mostly towards the positive social pressure. So, you know, letting folks, like thanking them for their vote history, saying stuff like, you know, hey, who you vote for is always private, but whether or not you vote is public record. We hope that we can thank you for voting in 2019 or 2020. So that's just something to think about. We have a ton more resources on our website about social pressure to help you kind of figure out which would be the best for you. But like I said, I would highly recommend staying away from the hard social pressure. One other thing to note when doing social pressure, it's really, really important to use actual vote history data. There was actually in Colorado a couple of years ago, an organization sent out a social pressure voter report card to a bunch of different voters and just gave everybody across the board, I think like a B-. And people were pissed because some people like me, I was like, hell no, like that's not my, like I have voted in every single election since I turned 18, like this will not stand. So that's just something to think about, is make sure that you're using correct data. Hopefully you have some support either through, you know, your state party or another infrastructure group who can help you get this data. All right, so let's keep going. So here are a couple of potential script examples that you could use specifically to use social pressure. So all of these would be considered social pressure. So things like saying, hey, official records show that you voted in 2014 and 2016, but missed the 2018 election. You know, again, for candidates, I would probably leave it at something like, official records show you voted in 2014 and 2016. Thank you so much for being a voter, and then kind of go into the rest of your script. What else? Public records show that you're a consistent and reliable voter. Thank you for voting in 2016. This is one that I really like to use and I think can be like a super, super gentle way to incorporate social pressure, but saying something like, you know, hey, we know that voting looks really different this year for our community, and we want to make sure that you had a good experience. So we may follow up with you after the election to hear how that experience went. So obviously, I think that's geared a little bit more towards organizations who, you know, are sort of up and running year round, which is a little bit different than a candidate campaign. But I think there's still ways that you can absolutely incorporate that into your script. But yeah, so those are just a couple of examples. Now I want to sort of show you how to put it all together. So if I was to put together a phone script, I would definitely start off with social pressure. So, obviously starting off with asking for the folks' name, telling them a little bit about your race, sort of what you're calling from, and then telling them something about their voting record. So here we have, hey, I see from official records that you voted in the last 2 elections, and I wanted to thank you so much for being a voter. So again, keeping it super positive, but letting them know, like, hey, your voting record is public information. And then I think a great next step is then to move into that voter self-rationalization to kind of open up the conversation. So, hey, on a scale of from 0 to 10, how likely do you think you're going to be voting on Tuesday? And then sort of based on that, hopefully folks are going to say like, I don't know, probably a 6, I don't know, a 7, I don't know, a 4. Then I think based on that, sort of depending on how that conversation goes, I think it's a really great segue then into plan making. So, okay, great. So, you said you're voting because you're really committed to kids having good schools in your neighborhood. And so you're voting in your, meow 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 race. Thank you so much for being a voter. And then moving into that plan making. So, okay, so you are in Colorado. So you're going to get your ballot in the mail. You should get them by yada, yada, yada. Do you plan on returning your ballot right away, or do you think you'll take some time to look over the candidates? So obviously there's a lot of different ways, and that's going to be super state specific, that plan making piece. So take we have a couple of recommendations of questions to ask, but remember, you really want to make sure that it's in line with how people can actually vote in your state. So make sure that you're being responsive that way. All right. Okay, so let's review everything we've gone over. I know it's kind of a lot, but you're going to have some time to practice and you're going to get some resources. Next slide. All right, so a couple of key takeaways when it comes to, remember, we're trying to change behavior of voters from non-voters or inconsistent voters to regular voters or to vote in this election. So really make sure you're emphasizing the voting process. So even though you're a candidate and you want to talk to folks about your issues, if you're talking to folks who you think are probably going to be with you but are less consistent voters, again, really try to focus on the voting process. You can do sort of a quick ID to make sure that they're with you, but again, focus on that voting process if you want to change that behavior. Ask voters to verbalize their reasons for voting. This is a great way to get folks talking, to sort of hear their responses and be able to respond accordingly. Move into plan making. Make sure that you're, again, think about this as an active listening. I've got a kitty who's trying to jump on my lap, an active listening exercise. It's not just about going through a checklist. And then utilize some positive and gentle social pressure. You want to tell the voter something about their vote history and figure out the type of social pressure that works best for you and your campaign. All right, so real quickly, I want to go over just a couple of GOTV resources that we have available to folks. So I do want to say, in order to access a lot of these, you do need to become a member of the Analyst group, which it's free to folks, but you do have to be either a part of an organization or sort of registered as a candidate. But if you are not and you want these resources, I'm sure someone at Vote Run Lead can get them for you. But so a couple things I want to highlight. We've got our GOTV recommendations and our toolkit. I sort of did a 30,000 foot view today, but there are more examples for mail pieces, scripts, recommendations about the different types of modes and contacts and things like that. We've got a GOTV FAQ. We've got some great resources on how to best use social pressure. So those are a couple of things that I wanted to highlight. But with that, that's all I have for you all today. Thank you so much for having me. And happy GOTVing, y'all.
Thank you so much, Mary. This was so awesome. I mean, you remind me that, oftentimes campaigning, there's an art, but there's also a science, right?
Yes.
There's a proven science. And so thank you so much, because these tools, you all, I have been following the Analyst Institute since 2012. I've employed these in campaign I've directed, and they work. So thank you so much. I was wondering, before we wrap up, Faith, you have tons of electoral experience as well. Are there any other take-home points from Mary's presentation that you gleaned?
I mean, that was fantastic and so much to take in, and thank you, Mary. Right, and just because learning point you should hear 3 times, right? And I just love the idea of a voter self-actualization and using the scale, because it's so many GOTV scripts I have seen have been, are you planning on voting? and you get a very flat yes or no answer, right? And it's really hard as the canvasser or the person on the phone, because it's COVID times, well, if we're going to do this on the phone, right, to have that follow-up conversation, right? But when you do a scale, you get to ask why it's an 8, why it's a 6, why it's not a 2. And so I think that's really smart. And I wish that I had used that in my last campaign. So that voter self-actualization, I think plan making is really important. And I was wondering, in states that do have vote by mail, we really should be pushing people to vote by mail and vote early. How much should we leave the plan making up to them versus pushing the way we'd like them to vote ideally?
That's a really good question. I think like there's not, so this is me as more of a practitioner versus at Analyst Institute. But I know when I was running programs in Colorado, we would typically focus on the way that most people voted, which was to drop off their ballot. And so that is typically like what we would focus the conversations on, because you do want to be careful about, there's this idea of like paradox of choice, where like if you are in a state that has lots of great voting options, which is amazing, but you don't want to be like, so you can do this, you can do this, you can do this, you can do this, you can do this. You really want to, like I think Faye said, that's a really great point. Like focus in on how most people are returning their ballot, or sort of based off of the conversation, like what you're hearing from this voter. And I think kind of focus in on that pathway. And then if they're like, I don't know, I would rather like vote in person. Okay, great. Then you pivot. So again, training here, like I can't emphasize enough, especially with plan making, how important training is to make sure that your volunteers know how to pivot without getting caught up and being like, okay, thanks, bye. Which like I've been there. I've been like I've canvassed probably a gazillion times, and I've definitely done that before. So.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. And I just want to emphasize the importance of training, and really by the time you're on day 157 of your campaign, doing another training on phone banking is going to feel really rote and boring, but doing that practice and that role play with your volunteers is really important. And then, making sure that you do that social pressure, thanking voters. But one of my very favorite things to do is really calling them a leader. Everyone likes compliments, right? And everyone feels more connected to you. And so on my campaign, I always said, thank you for being such a reliable voter. I wish we had more leaders like you in our district, right? Like putting them up there as kind of the best of the best. So thank you so much for all of this, Mary. It was super valuable information.
And I just want to let you all know, like Mary said, the Analyst Institute has amazing resources, so you can access them because you're a part of the VRL community. And so go ahead and look at them and then just put in VRL and we can track that for you. And if you want more information, just email us and we can give you more information about the Analyst Institute. But Mary, thank you so much. And I know we didn't have a lot of time and you just packed tons of information. So thank you.